Good evening, dreamers. This week's theme is experimental medications. Tonight, we're headed to a remote frog farm where one mistake turns into a nightmare of monstrous proportions. Remember, new videos premiere every night at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard, so be sure to join us for your nightly dose of eerie tales and unsettling dreams. Drop your theme suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a story. Now, sit back, close your eyes, and enjoy. It was mid-July, and the air felt like soup, thick and briny, choking the breath out of anyone dumb enough to step outside without thinking twice. Texas had a way of making you second-guess everything, even your own sweat. It didn't just beat up and roll off. It stuck to you, soaked you through, made your clothes cling like a second skin. But sweat was the least of my worries when I met Dick and his boy Richie. It started with an online job posting, something about frogs. I didn't think too hard about it at the time. It was just a blurb in black font, buried between ads for roofing and gas station clerks. Hands-on farm work, no experience needed, career opportunities, competitive pay. Call Dick at Frog Horizons. Frog Horizons sounded stupid as hell, but I was broke, fresh to Texas, and as far away from school as I could be. School was out of the question now, something my mother stopped nagging me about after I spent my first few weeks pacing the house like a caged animal. She told me I needed something real, a trade, she said, a skill. So when I called Dick and he said, "Come on down," I didn't think twice. I packed a lunch in a paper bag and took the bus out into the flat, dead middle of nowhere. The farm was not what I expected. The entrance was a dusty gravel drive with an old hand-painted sign perched to one side. The words, Frog Horizons, looked like they'd been slapped on with a wet brush, green paint crusting and peeling like algae. I squinted up at the thing for a long time, just staring at the smudge of a frog someone had drawn on it. Something about the frog's bulging eyes made my neck prickle. But he does that to you, makes you see things. The gravel crunched beneath my sneakers as I walked up to the main building, a squat tin shed that shimmered silver in the sun. The door creaked open before I even knocked. "You Malcolm?" The man who stepped out to greet me looked like he belonged to the land, like someone carved him straight out of the dirt and slapped a hat on him to make him appear human. He had on faded jeans, boots worn smooth at the soles, and a pearl snap shirt unbuttoned just enough to show the sunburned hollow of his throat. His face was all angles, sharp jaw, wide brow, and his eyes, deep set and too pale. They were shaded by a wide-brimmed cowboy hat.
"Yes, sir,"
I managed, though my voice cracked in the heat. "Name's Dick," he said. His hand shot out to grab mine, and the grip nearly crushed my knuckles. "Welcome to the farm, son." Behind him, another figure appeared, a younger one, Richie. Dick's boy was about my age, but he had that look, a kid who'd never been anywhere but here. His skin was tanned like old leather, and his forearms were corded with muscle, though his shoulders had a perpetual slouch. When he stepped to the light, I noticed something strange about the collar of his t-shirt. It was stretched just enough to show the scar that crept onto his collarbone. A mark, puckered and red, the kind that made you wince just to look at it.
"Richie, this here's Malcolm,"
Dick said.
"Show him around the place. Teach him what's what."
Richie didn't say a word. He just turned, jerked his head for me to follow, and started walking towards the facility. It was huge, bigger than I thought it would be. A chain-link fence stretched across the perimeter, half covered in tarps stained green and brown. Beyond it was a sprawling complex of tanks and pits, pipes and pumps. Metal scaffolding creaked above sunken pools the size of houses. And the smell. Oh God, the smell hit me like a slap to the face. It was part mud, part brackish water, part something else, something chemical. Richie led me to the first tank, where the water was as black as oil, and bubbles wriggled up to the surface like the ground itself was breathing.
"Tadpoles,"
he muttered.
"Tank 1. You'll be feeding them."
He didn't wait for questions, just moved on. Tank 2 was different. The water here was clearer, and hundreds, now maybe thousands of young frogs clung to the edge, their slick little bodies writhing over each other in clumps. They made a noise like faint whispers, little croaks echoing inside the tank walls.
"They're fed the hormone here,"
Richie said flatly.
"Once a day. Not too much, just enough."
I glanced at him, but his face gave me nothing. The last enclosure wasn't a tank at all, but a pit, a massive recessed floor lined with cement, deep enough that I couldn't see the bottom unless I leaned over the rail. What I did see was movement. Big, wet shapes shifting over each other in slow, deliberate waves. Frogs. Huge ones. Some of them were bigger than house cats, with pale bellies that pulsed and throats that ballooned. Richie pointed.
"Third cycle frogs. Mean bastards. You'll help sedate them."
I nodded, though my stomach was twisting. I didn't know why. I'd seen animals before. Hell, I'd been on field trips to farms, pigs, cows, chickens. But frogs? Frogs weren't animals you raised. They were the kinds of things you kicked away from the porch or pulled out of pools with a net. And yet, here they were, fat and pulsating, staring up at me with unblinking yellow eyes.
"Come on."
Richie turned away and headed back towards the shed. That first day, Dick handed me a pair of rubber boots and a bucket of food pellets that smelled like rotting fish. He gave me the same instructions twice, voice low and slow, like I was some half-wit he was being patient with.
"Feed the tadpoles. Not too much. When you get to the second tank, you measure out the hormone. 1 scoop per quadrant. Don't spill. Don't mix it up."
I didn't ask what would happen if I did. By sunset, I was sore from head to toe, drenched in sweat and something else that felt slimy against my skin. Richie hadn't said more than 2 words all day, though he'd caught me staring at his collarbone once or twice. That scar, it was almost like it was shaped, not random, like something had pressed it there, melted the flesh down to mark him.
You'll get used to it.
Richie said suddenly. It was the first thing he'd said to me all day that didn't involve tanks or scoops. He was leaning against the truck, arms crossed, watching the frogs in the pit.
It's not bad work.
Yeah? I asked. He didn't answer, just scratched at his collar absent-mindedly and stared into the dark. That night, when I got home, I dreamed of frogs, hundreds of them, packed together like meat. Their yellow eyes stared up at me as I shoveled pellets into their tank. But when I turned to leave, I heard a voice. Low, throaty, guttural. A voice that croaked my name. I woke up sweating. The second day was easier. My arms ached, but the rhythm of the work was predictable. Feed, measure, dump, repeat. I started to feel like I was getting the hang of it. The tadpoles swarmed when I dropped food into the black water. The second tank of froglings, those slick little bodies writhing like a pulsing green carpet, didn't even make me flinch anymore. I was useful. Finally. But the third day, that's when I got careless. It was hotter than the first 2 days combined. The air felt solid, like something you could chew. My head throbbed and sweat burned my eyes as I scooped out the medication for the tanks. Dick had been clear. Hormone for the second tank, sedative for the third cycle frogs in the pit. Simple. I knew it was simple. Except somewhere between the blistering heat and my aching muscles, I got mixed up. I didn't realize it until hours later, long after I dumped the hormone into the pit and the sedative into the second tank. I tried to tell myself it wasn't a big deal. They were just frogs. What was the worst that could happen? By the late afternoon the next day, the farm was wrong. It started with noises. The pit where the third cycle frogs usually sat, still and bloated, began to move. At first it was subtle, just a few ripples of motion, like the surface of the concrete was breathing. Then came the croaks, deep, guttural sounds that vibrated in my chest. I glanced at Richie, who was leaning against the fence, staring down into the pit with his mouth slightly ajar.
You hear that?
I asked.
Yeah,
He said, his voice hoarse.
I hear it.
We stepped closer to the railing. The frogs were moving faster now, their slick bodies shoving and writhing against each other. They looked bigger, their pale bellies stretched taut, their throats ballooning with every deafening croak. One of them leapt suddenly, high, slamming into the concrete wall with a sickening thud before flopping back down.
Jesus,
I whispered. The pit erupted. The frogs, dozens of them, began leaping, slamming into walls, into each other, their bodies twisted unnaturally, as if they were trying to tear themselves free of their own skin. One of them even burst like an overripe fruit, splattering the others with a thick, pinkish fluid. The croaking turned into a chorus of screams, wet, guttural screeches that made my teeth ache.
What the hell'd you do?
Richie shouted.
I don't know.
I stammered.
I think I mixed up the...
Before I could finish, a massive frog launched itself out of the pit. It sailed through the air like a cannonball, slamming into the fence so hard the chain link snapped. The thing hit the ground with a wet smack and started moving. Fast. It wasn't just big. It was wrong. Its legs were swollen and lumpy, its skin stretched thin and translucent. The yellow eyes bulged, unblinking, and its tongue lashed out, snapping at nothing.
Run!
Richie screamed. We bolted. Behind us, I heard the fence collapse as more frogs poured out of the pit. The ground shook beneath their weight. Thud, thud, thud. As they bound after us, their croaks turning into a monstrous howl. We sprinted to the shed, slamming the door shut behind us. Richie grabbed a shotgun off the wall and turned to me, his face pale and slick with sweat.
Call my dad,
he said. I fumbled for the phone on the desk, my hand shaking so hard I nearly dropped it. The line rang once, twice. Dick here, came the gravelly voice.
It's Malcolm,
I shouted.
The frogs, they're loose,
A massive crash cut me off. The shed shuddered as something slammed into the wall, hard enough to buckle the metal. Richie pumped the shotgun, his knuckles white.
Dad, get out here!
He screamed into the receiver.
On my way.
Dick growled. The wall caved in. A frog the size of a small car forced its way through the metal, its bloated body squeezing through the jagged hole with a sickening pop. Its tongue lashed out, whipping through the air and slapping against Richie's arm. He screamed as the thing yanked him off his feet, dragging him towards its gaping mouth. I grabbed a wrench off the desk and swung at its tongue, hitting it hard enough to tear the slick, fleshy surface. The frog let out a guttural shriek and released Richie, who scrambled backward, clutching at his bleeding arm. Then, the shotgun went off. The blast echoed through the shed as Dick stepped through the door, his face grim and streaked with sweat. He pumped the shotgun again and fired a second shot, blowing a hole clean through the frog's head. The thing collapsed, twitching, its yellow eyes rolling back into its skull.
Richie,
Dick barked.
you good?
Richie nodded, though his face was as white as a sheet. Dick turned to me, his pale eyes boring into mine.
What happened, boy?
I mixed up the tanks.
I stammered.
I didn't mean to.
He didn't say anything. He just pumped the shotgun again and stepped outside. The farm was chaos. Frogs, giant frogs, were everywhere. Their massive bodies crashing through fences and tanks, their tongues snapping at anything that moved. Some of them had started cannibalizing each other, tearing into flesh with their wide, toothless mouths. The air stank of blood and chemicals. Dick fired shot after shot, each blast echoing like thunder. One frog leaped at him, its mouth wide enough to swallow him whole, but he ducked and blew its head apart midair. Richie, limping behind him, holding the shotgun shells. I just stood there, frozen, watching the nightmare unfold. And then I heard the scream. Richie. I turned just in time to see a massive frog, easily the size of a truck, snap its tongue around Richie's waist and yanked him off the ground, his legs kicking wildly as he screamed for his father. The frog's mouth opened wide, and in one horrifying moment, it swallowed him whole.
No!
Dick roared. He ran at the thing, firing shot after shot, but the frog just croaked, a deep vibrating sound that rattled my bones, and turned towards the pit. It was heading back. The other frogs followed, bounding and crawling, dragging themselves towards the pit like they were being called home. The ground shook as they disappeared over the edge, one by one, their croaks fading into the darkness. By the time it was over, the farm was in ruins, tanks shattered, water flooding the ground, blood and slime smeared across the concrete. Dick stood at the edge of the pit, staring down into the blackness. He didn't say anything. He just turned to me, his eyes pale, cold, and empty.
Come here.
He said. I stepped forward, my heart hammering. He pulled a knife from his belt, a wicked thing with a curved blade, and he grabbed me by the collar. Before I could protest, he pressed the blade to my skin and carved a mark into my collarbone. The pain was sharp and white hot, but I didn't scream. I couldn't. When he let go, I staggered back, clutching the fresh wound.
Well, boy, you're one of us now.
Dick said. I looked at him, at the scar on his son's collarbone. Richie hadn't been the first, and I wouldn't be the last.